Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar called The Path from Pledges to Progress, How Companies are Working to Decarbonize Today to Meet the Ambition of Tomorrow. I'm Verena Radulovich. I'm Vice President of Business Engagement for the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And in case you haven't heard of us, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization, and we're committed to advancing climate solutions and the technologies and policies to promote them, both pragmatic and ambitious. We advance business action on climate through our Business Environmental Leadership Council, which is a group of Fortune 500 companies committed to addressing climate change. And we do this by bringing together stakeholders with different perspectives and across different sectors to build common ground. Today, we're going to look at how key sectors in our economy are transitioning to a low carbon future. As a growing number of companies make ambitious commitments, especially this week during Climate Week, and these commitments increasingly look to 2050 and beyond, progress towards these goals is dependent on industries prioritizing action today. So we're going to hear from industry leaders in aviation, utilities, and finance, companies that are in our Business Environmental Leadership Council, for a discussion around how they're working to transform their industries and tackle these challenges as they're working to address climate change. We're going to delve into their current progress towards our climate commitments and what it takes to achieve these goals. A few housekeeping items before we start. There will be opportunities for the audience to ask panel questions throughout the webinar. So we'd like this to be a dynamic conversation. Please send in questions as they come in, I think through the Q&A, not directly into the chat, but into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address them throughout the discussion. So I will be looking at them while also moderating with our panelists. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube site, probably in the next 1 or 2 days. So if you'd like to listen to it or share it with colleagues, it will be available. Today, we're really lucky. We have with us a distinguished panel. We are joined by Jill Blickstein, who is Managing Director and Head of ESG at American Airlines. We have Carlos Brown, who's Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Compliance Officer at Dominion Energy, which is a very large utility based in Virginia. And Rama Variankaval, who's Managing Director and Head of the new Center for Carbon Transition at JPMorgan Chase. So before we get into a moderated conversation, I'd like to move up to our 3 panelists and ask them to each provide a brief description of their company's climate targets and a broad overview of how their companies are planning to achieve them to set the table for the rest of our discussion. And Jill, I will start with you.
Okay, thank you, Verena. It's a pleasure to be here, and I just want to make one little plug for C2ES. It's we're a recent member, actually at the recommendation of JPMorgan, so we're full circle here, and really love being a member of the bank. So thank you for your leadership on that. So at American, we have a net zero 2050 target, which we set right in the heart of COVID, actually, last year. And recently, we've committed to set a science-based target for 2035. So we're in the midst of that. Our plan to reach net zero is a mix of the things that are really under our direct control and the things where we have to work in partnership with other industries and with government. So in the near term, we have fuel efficiency initiatives in our own operations, and importantly, we've been we're in the middle, or we're towards the end of a major fleet renewal effort where we've invested $24 billion in about 600 new aircraft that are more fuel efficient. And then over time, obviously, we continue to buy more aircraft, and generally each generation of aircraft is 15 to 20% more fuel efficient than the one it replaces. But we're really looking to new technologies that will really help decarbonize aviation over the long term. So here I'm talking about new modes of propulsion like electric and hydrogen fuel cells. And there are some really interesting new technologies, basically to retrofit the smaller regional jets, which tend to be less efficient with hydrogen. And then air traffic control reform, which has great promise to bring new technologies so we can become more efficient in the air and on the ground. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, sustainable aviation fuel, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later. So those are our goals, and that's our plan to get there. And we've actually published some detail around how we would get there in our ESG report, and that's on our website.
Thank you, Jill. Carlos, I will turn to you next.
Thanks, Verena, and thanks for having me on this panel. First, a little bit about Dominion Energy, for those of you who aren't familiar with the company. We are a large integrated utility. We're the 3rd or 4th largest integrated utility by market cap in the country, with about 17,000 employees, and we currently have operations in about 16 states and about 7 million customers. We believe that we are the leading edge in the utility space with regard to a decarbonization effort We have an announced $72 billion investment program over the course of the next 15 years to build and reposition our generation fleet. We think it's the most, we know it is the most aggressive and announced decarbonization effort of anyone else in our industry. In 2020, we announced our commitment to net zero with regard to our scope one emissions. But in Virginia, we've partnered with the legislature, and in Virginia, which is where our largest utility operation is, we have a commitment to zero emissions by 2045. We are also actively looking at scope 3, referencing Jill's point, where we're looking at our supply chains and those that we work with to further help decarbonize. Just a little bit about what we've done thus far. Prior to our net zero commitment, we'd already reduced our CO2 emissions by 45% since our 2005 levels, and we've reduced our methane emissions by 31% since 2010. So we were well along this effort, just recognizing the importance of being a part of that program. But we believe with our new program of investment, we will hit our goals, but also maybe even exceed them. Just a couple of things about what we are doing directly with regard to our scope 1. We are investing in building the largest offshore wind facility in the Western Hemisphere, quite frankly. We're going to be filing for approval in November to build 2,600 megawatts of offshore wind. Our legislation requires us to build or acquire 16,000 megawatts by 2035 of solar. And we're well along the way in acquiring the resources we need to do that. But as we are thinking about that, we're also very mindful of our customers and of the equity and environmental justice impacts of this large effort to decarbonize. And so hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit later.
Thank you, Carlos. And Rama, if you can talk about JPMorgan Chase's efforts and specifically this Center for Climate Transition that you are, or Center for Carbon Transition that you are leading.
Sure. Thanks, Verena. Thanks for having me. JPMorgan Chase, we are a global financial services company with businesses really all around the world, touching different parts of the financial services sector, right? I would say that we have a number of climate-related commitments that we have made over the years. I'll touch on one, which is a big one, and also one where I'm personally spending a lot of time on, which was a commitment we made in October of last year to Paris align our financing book, starting with the oil and gas, power, and auto portfolios. So what that really means is to essentially measure the carbon footprint of clients in these three sectors, clients of JPMorgan in these three sectors, aggregate that up to the portfolio level for JPMorgan, and then to put a target on that was Paris aligned. And we put 2030 intermediate targets. So that was the ambition that we announced in October of last year. In May of this year, we published a methodology that we are calling Carbon Compass, which lays out how we propose to do that. Right? It's every piece of that it has obviously its complexities. Right? Just measuring the carbon footprint of different companies in different sectors has a number of challenges. Then to come up with a credible target for some of these sectors and subsectors that was Paris aligned is obviously fairly complex as well. So took a fair amount of work. We're definitely very proud of what we've been able to achieve. And now is the even more complex but really important part that we are spending time on, and that's where the Center for Carbon Transition fits into the picture, which is engaging with our clients. Right? So by definition, what we are doing is putting a target on the emissions we are financing through financing our clients by either lending them capital directly or facilitating capital raise for them in the capital markets. Right? So that's what we are measuring and putting a target on. So it's critical that we engage with our clients, because as they decarbonize, as they transition their business models, then naturally our own portfolio looks better. And it's a critical piece of what we've been spending a lot of time on.
Great, thank you very much. So let's segue into the first question. And all three of you have laid out kind of the overarching goals, as well as sort of the mechanisms to get there, which was excellent across the three companies. But let's focus in the more immediate term, and then we'll kind of look out into the horizon later in this webinar. What are the actions or investments that your company is undertaking now in the short term that support these longer term climate targets? And when we're thinking about these short term actions, I'm curious, what are are there any specific challenges or barriers that you're facing? And then conversely, in the immediate term, are you seeing some opportunities that you're really excited about? And so, just for the sake of the order, we'll start with Jill again.
Okay, great. Aviation's a little bit unique in that we don't have really significant near-term opportunities to reduce our emissions. We can buy new aircraft, and that certainly helps, but sustainable aviation fuels, I think, as you know, are not available at scale today. And some of the new technologies like electric and hydrogen are like just the beginning of development. So for example, American invested in an eVTOL company called Vertical, and eVTOL is electric vertical takeoff and lift. And so that's like it's the beginning. It's obviously not a replacement for a full-on passenger jet, but it's the beginning of the technologies that will one day lead to some electrification of aviation. The big announcement we made this Monday, actually, that I'm super excited about is we're investing $100 million in Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is an arm of the broader Breakthrough Energy venture, Breakthrough Energy family. And the idea behind Catalyst is using low-cost capital to really accelerate those technologies that in the future will lead to our decarbonization, right? We don't have those tools now, but we can't basically wait. Like wind and solar took decades to develop. That's kind of the line. And we can't wait that long for sustainable aviation fuel to come about. So we're really excited to partner with Microsoft and General Motors and Bank of America and others. We're to join Breakthrough Energy Catalyst and hopefully to make investments in projects that will bring about sustainable aviation fuel. Breakthrough Energy Catalyst is investing in sustainable aviation fuel, green hydrogen, long-term battery storage, and direct air capture. So we thought those are 4 technologies that can really help both the broader economy and certainly aviation.
That's cool. And Jill, just before I move on to Carlos, is that more of a maybe can you tell the audience a little bit about what that looks like when you're investing the $100 million with the other companies? What is that intending to do in the short term?
So together, we're going to look for projects that are right at the tilt point into commercial scale. So Breakthrough is assembling a team with the expertise to locate, and in fact, they just issued an RFI to try to solicit these kinds of projects in those 4 technology areas, but looking for the projects where our low-cost capital and Breakthrough Energy Catalyst is assembling sort of low-cost debt, low-cost equity, loan guarantees, and even grant capital. So if you saw the announcement, I see the BlackRock Foundation as an investor, because there's this opportunity to use a really unique capital mix to try to invest in projects. And maybe Rama could speak to kind of the role that the big banks can play in financing some innovative technologies, particularly with really tiny companies, startups that don't have a long track record. We're trying to figure out how to use this low-cost capital mix to really give a boost to projects where you can see that they could help scale the market down the road.
That's great. Great. We will turn to Rama in just a moment. In the meantime, I would like to thank you, Jill. Carlos, I'll turn to you. So again, the question is, when we're thinking about what are the investments or actions that are happening now, particularly in the power sector, so much of the eyes are on the power sector because of the role that it plays in decarbonizing buildings and the interest in electrification of transportation. So where is Dominion focusing its time and resources in the short term for these efforts?
So, we use a term frequently on our leadership team called, where are we going to get the biggest bang for the buck, right? And so we're looking at our entire enterprise. But, you raise a very important point. Utilities have the opportunity to be a global solution provider, right? I mean, we understand energy needs, we study energy needs, we understand, and we've monitored technology and its development. And so to the degree that we're leaning into this space, we have the opportunity to be a solutions provider to so many other segments of the economy. So first, when you're looking at the biggest bang for the buck, I think utilities have made significant efforts to decarbonize, and I think we are no longer the leading emitter of CO2. I think that currently now exists with transportation, but our desire is to help transportation. And so when it comes to whether it be the ports or when it comes to developing EV infrastructure, we believe that we can be kind of the point of the spear in helping to drive that change. But where are we kind of first focused? So when we talk about getting to net zero, there always is an assumption that that's net zero with reliability, right? No one has suggested that we would compromise reliability and energy in order to get to the net zero. So one of the first things we're doing is we're relicensing our nuclear facilities, because the nuclear facilities are the most efficient, affordable forms of zero emission energy that we currently produce. And so we've started that effort. We've done that with our Surrey plant, and we are seeking to do that with North Anna and our other facilities. In addition to that, we've talked about the new investment, new build, right? So we're building offshore wind, we're building solar as aggressively as we can. We are also working with policymakers to talk about electrification, right? I mean, we think that we can partner with automakers and transportation departments and multifamily facilities to build the infrastructure to help folks get over the range anxiety, to make the adoption of EVs simple and frontless for families that are concerned about, well, if I do the EV, am I going to be able to charge? Can I make the journey and will disrupt my life? And we think that will be a very impactful effort. We're looking at methane strategies, right? I mean, there still will be the need for natural gas at some level, whether it be in power generation or for people that use it to heat their homes or their buildings or their offices. And so again, looking at leak detection, right? Because we know that methane has a 25% higher carbon intensity than does other pollutants, right? So, and then of course, retiring fossil, right? I mean, that is a part of that effort. So we're building new green while we're retiring fossil, while we're also investing in battery technology as well as existing battery storage. So there's a whole pantheon of areas that we're playing, and we're prioritizing those based on where we're going to get the biggest reduction in the short term. And based upon our climate study that we've just recently released and others, we know that we can get essentially about 85% of the way there, right, to our net zero goal with these efforts. And then we're going to need some help with technology, right? Then we'll need help with technology, offsets, and other items, hopefully the items that Rama and Jill are talking about with regard to the investment area.
And Carlos, I think that in the beginning of the webinar, you'd mentioned that the focus on equity. Is that something that Dominion is weaving in at the moment, or is that more of a medium term or longer term goal?
No, I mean, we talk about that in every strategy session, because what we have to understand, and I think there's a later question we're going to get to where I thought we'd bring this up, but as we can decarbonize as aggressively as our customers can accommodate that, and as aggressively as policymakers and regulators are willing to accommodate that. But when you build new, right, and you decommission old, there is an economic cost to that. And if I'm going to be able to attract the capital that Rama's firm and others are going to look to provide, we're going to be able to show that we can provide a return on that capital. So there is a social cost to decarbonization, and we have to be sure that we're not burdening low wealth communities disproportionately with that, right? Because someone who lives in one of our higher income areas in Northern Virginia that has a high income, that drives a Tesla, they may be able to take a $5, $10 rate shock on their monthly bill, where someone who lives in one of our low wealth communities cannot. And we feel it's incumbent upon us as the utility, as a public service organization, to keep that front and center with regard to our policymakers, right? I mean, we love the initiative and the support, but we also want them to remember that unless we're going to provide some accommodation, those individuals are going to be impacted disproportionately. And so there are things that we've done in Virginia where we have a program that was adopted in legislation last year that allows a customer's utility bill to be tied to their income level. And so we're a proponent of that. And this past year, we forgave about $200 million worth of customer arrears due to the pandemic. So we're very mindful of that. And we want to be engaged in that conversation.
Okay. Thank you. We'll get back to that in the next set of questions. But I'd like to shift to Rama to ask you, when we're looking at it, so a bank is in many ways different than an airline or utility, where a lot of the emissions that are being emitted, Carlos, I think you mentioned your scope 1 emissions, that these are scope 1 emissions from these sectors, from transportation as well as from utilities, is a significant part of US greenhouse gas emissions. And the emissions of the bank itself may be smaller, but the financing of companies that produce these emissions is sort of where I feel like the meat of the issue is. So can you talk about your perspective in the short term? Where do you feel that the financial sector can have the biggest impact in supporting these decarbonization efforts today?
Yeah, no, look, and you're absolutely right. The direct footprint, carbon footprint of a firm like JPMorgan is relatively small, but that doesn't mean that we are not paying attention to it. We have fairly best-in-class commitments on that area, and then we spend a lot of time on that, right? But it is the real discussion is in fact on financed emissions, right? Who are we financing and what is their footprint? Look, I think the way I think about it, a bank's toolkit is primarily strategic advice and help in capital formation, right? Pretty much everything can be boiled down to one of those two things that we do, right? And both have a role to play here, right? When clients, maybe American Airlines, maybe Dominion, whoever it might be, right? When they are grappling with the question of what is their strategy when it comes to decarbonization, right? What kind of assets should they own? How should they operate them? And how should they tell their story, right? Those are things we spend a lot of time with our clients on, right? On a variety of other topics, but including on carbon footprint, right? That, I would say, is where we are spending a fair amount of time on. The other is capital formation. Again, I break that down into a couple pieces. They're very related. One is a lot of large companies, let's call them legacy clients of banks like ours, have, again, very simplistically and crudely, I would say, an environmental liability or a climate liability. Mm-hmm. They're trying to mitigate or reduce, right? And that mitigation is going to be capital intensive, right? It just is, right? And again, that's where our ability to facilitate capital formation has a role to play, right? Either us using our balance sheet or us efficiently connecting capital seekers to capital providers, again, which is what we do normally. That's a role we can play and we do play, right? Then the other end of the spectrum is these kind of newer technologies that are being seeded and need a lot of capital to really become commercially viable in scale, right? Whether it's synthetic aviation fuel, whether it's direct air capture, all the stuff you talked about, they require capital as well, right? Again, this is unlike the previous maybe big shift we saw in the global economy, which was the tech revolution, let's call it, right? Which, relatively speaking, was not capital intensive, right? This one's quite different. I think it is even more important and even more of a shift in many ways, but it is different in that it's going to be capital intensive. That you can take your favorite study, but the annual cost of this is going to be in the $3 to $4 to $5 trillion a year. Right? Want to stay on track to Paris. So that's the other area. How do we best help in capital formation for these newer technologies, which, by the way, look quite different than what we are typically used to bank. At the risk-reward framework that we would typically use, right? If we apply that to a direct air capture project, it doesn't look that good. So how do we think about the new way of evaluating risk and reward as the world is changing around us is something we are spending a lot of time on, and it's something that I think the financial industry overall needs to spend a lot of time on to figure out.
Before we move into that direction of what the next sort of medium term looks like, Rama, do you have a sense of, can you kind of give a little bit more detail on what are some of the topic areas that some of the clients are coming to the Center for Assistance on, and maybe share, if you can, generally, what is the level of knowledge that some of the firms that you're engaging with? Obviously, we have two firms here who are incredibly, forward thinking in terms of where they want to take their companies. But can you give us a sense of the kinds of other, where some of the other clients are at in the process?
I mean, we like to, I think, hit ourselves and think that we know a lot about different operating models, but that's never true. Our clients know more about their business than we do, always. And, this is a topic of survival for most of our clients, right, across the sectors. And so I won't pretend that somehow we know more about how how this issue impacts anyone's business model. Where we are getting questions is, the intersection of operating business models, capital flows, right? What are asset owners thinking about? What are asset managers thinking about, right? And policy, right? It's that intersection that we can add a lot of value, right? I definitely cannot tell Jill anything about how to run an airline business. I would have zero idea, right? But I could maybe sit down with Jill and say, look, this is where I see institutional investors in the public domain who may own American Airlines today or could potentially own American Airlines in the future, what their preferences are when it comes to this issue. What do they care about? How do they evaluate? Are they looking at third-party scoring to evaluate American Airlines? Are they thinking of building their own models? How much is climate important versus social issues versus governance issues? Those are the kinds of things. Or what's our read of what policy, how policy winds are blowing? That's where we really add value. And I think that's where we are getting questions from our clients today, right? I'm a company, I own this portfolio of assets. I understand some of it has some problems associated with it. How do I minimize that? And what's again, the best way to do that?
I think what I appreciate about the Center for Carbon Transition is that you're connecting with other companies and the advice or the feedback or the ideas can also come from a different kind of voice, not necessarily a voice that is branded as like an environmental NGO, but as a company. And so I think one of the interests that we have as an organization with C2ES is to really, how do we empower others across sectors, across the different industries, and particularly among those that have that trusted ear that can help other industries decarbonize. So that was another reason why we were interested in learning more about JPMorgan's efforts. But I'd like to segue into the second question. So we've looked at kind of the near term and what all the different aviation utilities and banking are doing. But one thing I want to do is if you can vision out for me a little bit what the medium and longer term is. And when I would say medium, let's say the next 5 to 7 years, there's a lot of attention being put on that this is the decade by which we need to take action. And I think when we look at the plethora of net zero targets, which I think are fantastic, that more and more companies are setting them, immediately there's also attention on, well, okay, what are companies going to do in the next, in the short term and in the medium term? And that's sometimes hard to do because I think as you three of you have stated that sometimes the future isn't always as easy to see as, but to the extent that you can, maybe walk me through what the medium term looks like, and especially what needs to change in the world in this coming decade that complements your company's efforts, recognizing we're all interconnected. What would you like to see, what needs to happen in the world around your company and to make those medium term actions? So what's the medium and longer term, and then what needs to change in the world to help that happen? Jill, we'll start with you. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about sustainable aviation fuel.
One of my favorite topics, sustainable aviation fuel. Verena knows that I'll bend her ear on this anytime. It's actually much more exciting than you might think. So the idea is jet fuel that meets the specifications of petroleum jet fuel, but can be dropped in to current fueling systems and current aircraft. So if you've flown out of California in the last 5 years, you've probably flown on a jet that has some amount, maybe just a teaspoon, but some amount of sustainable aviation fuel. Today, there's very little SAF being produced. Sorry, we call it SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. There's very little being produced in the world today, really only a small handful of producers. In the US, I think we produced maybe 5 million gallons last year, and US Airlines in a good year burn somewhere between 18 and 20 billion gallons of fuel. So tiny little market really needs to grow. Today, SAF is made from waste oils. So for example, we're buying fuel from Neste. It's made, the feedstock is beef tallow, but there's all different kinds of waste oils, including things like used cooking oil that can be collected from restaurants, that can be manufactured. Today in the US, we make a lot of renewable diesel from these kinds of waste oils, but really there is not a lot of SAF being produced today. And with this kind of SAF, it's called HEFA SAF, which is hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. The HEFA SAF has a life cycle emissions reduction of 75%. relative to petroleum jet fuel. And it does have to be blended today at 50-50 with kerosene jet. But one day that blend wall will go away. So think about a 75% reduction in aviation emissions. I mean, it's really an enormous number, and it's only going to get better from there because the technologies are getting better. And I saw one question in the chat was about, what are the fuels out to 2040, 2050? I mean, there's this idea on paper that people are working on today to move beyond the waste oils into things like turning municipal solid waste into jet fuel, which would have an even higher life cycle reduction, turning corn distillates or other kind of waste products, for example, into jet fuel. Then there's the idea to pull CO2 out of the air and use green electricity to turn that into jet fuel. And that has the potential to have 100% life cycle emissions reduction relative to petroleum jet fuel. And Verena, the way you phrased the question was, what else has to happen in the world? Well, we need a huge boost in renewable electricity. So Carlos, thank you for the wind farm. Like we need a lot more renewable electricity in order to help fuel some of these new renewable fuels. But Verena, to your question about sort of the next 5 to 10 years, it's really sustainable aviation fuel. And then looking further out, it's these new modes of propulsion that we hope to really come to the fore. Oh, and I should just mention, sorry, we have Prometheus is one of our partners working on these novel processes, which is turning CO2, pulling CO2 out of the air and turning it into jet fuel. And they announced today a close in funding and a big investment from Maersk, which is the big cargo shipping company. So really excited for Prometheus, and we think they hold a lot of promise. So very excited about that.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Yeah. So in other words, if I'm flying in an aircraft, I may not know that it has sustainable aviation fuel in it.
Because it meets the technical it performs exactly the way kerosene jet fuel does.
And what, before I move to Carlos, tell me a little bit about what that means for the industry as a whole. Because right now you're purchasing jet fuel, which has a very sophisticated and well-trod supply chain. And I imagine that when you're purchasing a different kind of fuel from what sounds like maybe different supply chains, can you just talk a little bit about that and what that means for the way business is done in the short, and then you can see it like moving into the medium term?
Yeah, it's a really important question. The whole logistics and supply chain is going to be a huge issue. So we're buying fuel from Neste. It's being finished in Houston, shipped on the water into San Francisco, and then it's fed into the Kinder Morgan pipeline and it's brought into the airport by pipeline. So that's the existing fuel system essentially that our SAF can travel, which is terrific. But for all the new SAF that's coming, like it may not make sense to source to produce that in California for lots of reasons. And so if you start to produce fuel where the feedstocks are produced, maybe in the middle of the US, all of a sudden we're out of sync with the fuel supply chain. And so logistics, we spend a lot of time, we hear a lot of great ideas about how to produce sustainable aviation fuel. And as soon as we get to the question about logistics, people are like, well, we're not so sure about how we're actually going to get it. How do you get it to the big hub airport? So I think that's going to be an area where government research and support is going to play an interesting role in kind of helping us figure out what these new supply chains look like.
Got it. Okay. So Rama, I think building on what you were saying earlier, kind of in the short term, I guess one question is, I want to understand a bit more about what JPMorgan has learned so far. And I think when you're working with your clients, like where can the financial industry build its capacity and expertise to keep helping the clients along this decarbonization pathway? And I have a couple more questions for you, but let's start with there. Like, as we think about the medium term and kind of, and I think with a bank especially, it's banks right now are under a lot of scrutiny to sort of identify, like, what are you going to be doing over the next, couple of years?
I did notice.
Sure. Yeah. But I'm curious if you can speak to what you've learned so far, and especially where the financial industry, you think that they can build their capacity further.
Look, I mean, I've learned a lot because I didn't come with a whole lot of background. I had to be very candid about some of the technical issues involved here. What I've also learned is, again, as I said, we have targets now on oil and gas, power and auto sectors. We have publicly said we are working on aviation, paper and pulp. Then, of course, we also talk to tech companies and consumer companies, etc. Right? So our perspective is definitely drawn from talking to companies and individuals in different sectors of the economy. And what's pretty clear to me, candidly, is that there is very little debate on where do we want to end up. Right? I don't think anybody is debating that necessarily. It's really just how do we get there, right? Balancing, I think clearly in my mind, the two critical issues are, on one hand, speed is of essence because, time is our enemy in many ways, right? If you wait too long, that's bad. On the other hand, and I think Carlos was very clear when he stated, you have to do that in a way that is equitable, right? You can't do it in a way that, just, disproportionately impacts people who already are maybe disproportionately impacted by lots of things going on in the world, right? So how do you make that balance, I think, is important. And there I definitely, hear quite different points of views, right? When we talk to clients in, let's say, oil and gas, and, like the role of natural gas, right, is something we debate from, with all kinds of people, right? And is natural gas a bridge fuel or is it not, right? So things of that sort. And I think there is merit to a lot of, arguments that different folks make. We just need to quickly decide what path are we taking and then get on it. Because again, time is of essence. And look, again, I think intentions are all in the right place, right? I haven't met a client in any sector who fundamentally disagrees with the path, for example, that JPMorgan is charting, right? I think the fact that we have been as close to science-based and objective as is possible, knowing what we know today, I think that is appreciated by everyone, right? Regardless of which side of the spectrum they are. Are they a very carbon-intensive business, or are they definitely a low carbon or no carbon business?
One thing thank you, that's very helpful. One thing I think about, Rama, this is a follow-up question for you. And this is sort of in the model of when a lot of large corporations over the last about 5 or 6 years have, some of their strategy for engaging their suppliers is to, help work with their suppliers to reduce their emissions. But increasingly, some companies have been asking their supply chain to set aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets. I think it was Salesforce that recently may have done so. And we have examples of other companies that either are asking companies to take certain measures or to flat out also set net zero targets. And they do that in part because it's kind of a conversation starter. Companies up the supply chain have to, measure their emissions and think about reducing them. Is in a parallel example, could you ever see, or is there value in sort of engaging with clients and also asking them to set net zero targets as a table setter exercise? Or is that really, not the strategy? There are other effective ways to go about it.
Yeah, look, we have a Paris aligned target, right? So it's at the portfolio level, and we, on a daily basis, engage with our clients on their aspirations, right? I personally don't think, we are at a point where we can go tell every client that we will only do business with them if they have a net zero target. I think that's, again, in my mind, we also need to be intellectually honest. There are lots of sectors where that's just not a feasible ask to make. Of course, you can put out a commitment for some date, many decades from now, and say, okay, we'll figure it out later, right? But if you're being intellectually honest, we have to recognize that, lots of stuff needs to happen both on the technology side and on the policy side for net zero to be realistic in certain sectors of the economy. And we bank those, right? And those, every sector of the economy plays a role in the economy. So it's for us to put a condition on having a net zero target, to me, seems at this point premature. As technology develops, right, as it's happening at a rapid pace, there's no doubt about it. Right? SAF, as Jill talked about, again, just literally, every day we talk to a few companies which are coming up with some new technology to decarbonize some sector of the economy, right? So that gives me, by the way, I'm super excited in those conversations. But that needs to move along a little bit more, and then policy needs to change too. There's a lot of things on the policy side which needs to happen before we can realistically say that every client of JPMorgan needs to have a net zero target.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's a great segue to climate, but I just want to check in with Carlos to see if the fire alarm is still going off. I don't know if Carlos, if you're able to go off mute, so we can kind of bring you back into the discussion. Okay, Carlos is still on mute. So what I will do is we'll shift to the discussion on policy, and then if Carlos is able to come back, we will re-engage him on the other two questions above. So, and then we can also look at some of the questions that are coming in. All right, so I do want to shift the conversation to policy. We are in a unique moment in time, about 5 or 6 weeks out from the COP26. We have a lot happening currently in Congress that is being looked at when it comes to climate. There's a lot of activity here. Well, one thing that our organization C2ES, we always focus on is, what are the broader policies that are needed to move our economy forward into a decarbonized future? And what I think has been really unique about the conversation so far, and looking at how the different companies have, what you're doing with your companies, but how there's this interconnection to different to other kinds of companies. Let's talk about the role of policy. And Rama, you mentioned it. Jill, I think in some of our conversations, you mentioned it. Oh, Carlos is back. Awesome. Let's do the policy, and then Carlos, I'm gonna turn to you to basically wrap it up for us. All right. So specifically, Jill, I'll go back to you. Where is the public policy necessary to help advance the decarbonization in airlines, both in the near term and then in the longer term?
So there's a lot of exciting news on that front, like really more than I ever could have wished for. So two major advances, I think. One is that there's a SAF tax credit, blender's tax credit that has been included in the reconciliation bill. And it was designed by the industry working with the fuel producers. Like there's this big multi-industry coalition, which is terrific. Like whenever you see that, you know that maybe something has legs, right? That has the potential to incent fuel producers potentially away from renewable diesel, and into sustainable aviation fuel production. So there's hundreds of millions of gallons of renewable diesel being produced in the US today. And with this revised tax credit, there's the potential to really shift that. As it's been explained to me, the federal incentive structure, the federal state incentive structure for renewable fuels has been around for decades, but sustainable aviation fuel is a relatively new entrant. And so it hasn't quite accommodated that, but that really has the potential to both encourage new production and then to shift some production in the US, particularly as road transport electrifies. The other really exciting thing is that the White House and 3 federal agencies have really gotten behind sustainable aviation fuel. So there was a big White House event a couple of weeks ago. The Departments of Energy, Transportation and Agriculture have signed an MOU with the goal of really producing enough SAF to fuel the entire US aviation industry by 2050. It's just a huge goal. And I started my career in the US government, and the idea that 3 federal agencies would get together on a problem, like I say this to other people who didn't work in government, and they're like, well, shouldn't government always do that? But government doesn't always do that. Like, it's kind of amazing. And it wasn't that we asked them to. It's like they, on their own, they realized that they really have the power and the potential to really change this. And so that's why I have a lot of hope in the policy area, despite, you might look around and see things don't work so well in the policy area, but I can see like the potential for real progress.
And what do you think that will do for private sector investment when you see those government signals?
I think it's gonna drive it. I mean, I think I think Rama just brought up that, we hear from our customers all the time. It's like the golden age of sort of customer engagement on climate, right? They want us to share with them and work with them to meet their own climate goals. And so when you have really this clear desire coming from the corporate side and the clear willingness, to engage on the government side, it feels like things are actually meshing, and there might really be the potential to have these things be complementary. So I have high hopes for real gains.
Great. I'll turn to Rama for the policy question, and then Carlos, I'll turn back. Carlos, welcome back. I will turn to you to walk you through the second question and then the third one as well together. So Rama, I think you mentioned this earlier before I jump back to Jill. When we're looking at the public policy measures that are necessary, when you're looking at, especially across the different portfolios that you're looking at now, oil and gas, auto, utilities, where do you see the need for public policy to help move these industries or other industries down a pathway to decarbonization?
We have a list of 10 things, but 1 through 9 are carbon pricing, right?
Okay.
It's just, in my mind, there is nothing more important than having some kind of a carbon price. And goes back to, when I first was talking about JPMorgan and the role that banks play, right, in capital formation. The only way you can optimize capital formation, right, put capital to work where there is the most impact, is to have a framework of risk and reward. Right? That's how capital providers view the world. What's the risk I'm taking? What's the reward I get? The only way we can actually analyze risk and reward in a project for direct air capture or a SAF or green hydrogen or whatever it is to have an implied price on carbon. Without that, it makes no sense. Right? Mm-hmm. There will not be enough capital flowing into these important relevant technologies, right? Without having a meaningful price on carbon. Right now, the market, Europe says it's $80 a ton. California says it's $18 a ton, right? Just make up a number, right? And so how can you optimize capital flow in a world like that? So I think, to me, having a clear price on carbon, right, is critical, right? Again, because I'm a banker, so I see it this way, right? It's like I have a hammer and all I see is nails. But I do think of carbon as an asset class. Mm-hmm. No different than credit, right? And just like when we analyze credit, we have lots of market information. There is a clear price on credit, different quality of credit. I think that evolution is necessary in carbon. I think that's, to me, the most critical one.
And do you think that alone, that carbon price would, because it would catalyze investments in some of these more nascent technologies? Like, would the flows more naturally go to things like direct air capture or other, there's some questions that are coming in, like, for example, how do we set aside investment funds to support early stage companies that will help meet these targets? Can you speak just a little bit to sort of how a price on carbon would the interplay between price on carbon and that?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I said the price on carbon was $500 a ton, I think all of a sudden, all the technologies we have talked about in the last 45 minutes become commercially viable like tomorrow, mm-hmm. Right? At $50, it's a more, it's a debate, right? And maybe there is a different prioritization of where capital flows, right? Depending on where the price on carbon is. So, and that is the role of, and that is the discipline that capital market bring to any technology development, right? And so I think that's important. Because we don't have that, candidly, in my mind, there is a lot more focus on things like, grant money and foundations, and the whole concessionary capital kind of, domain, if you will, is more front and center, because you have to, if you don't have a price on carbon, the only other way you can make the math work is to have a concessionary layer of capital, which supports the market price layer of capital. I'm not saying that it's either or. I mean, the grant money, the role of grant money is always going to be there. But I do think that to mobilize capital to the extent we need, at the speed we need, I don't think just the grant money is going to be sufficient. We need, economically motivated capital to flow to it. And that'll only happen if there is clarity on carbon price.
Great.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I will say, away from carbon, I did say I have 10 things on my list. Only 9 were carbon pricing. The 10th is disclosure, right? I mean, the SEC obviously has put out some guidance. That's the other thing, right? You can't assess your investment opportunities if there is not good enough disclosure. Right? How do I again make an assessment of what am I making an investment in? So standardizing disclosure, right? Consistent, comparable disclosure is such an important piece of the whole decarbonization story as well.
Thank you. Very helpful. I will shift back to Carlos. Carlos, welcome back. Glad to see your room is hopefully not on fire. You're with us. If you do need to turn your screen off, if your internet is shaky, then just, we hear you, we see you. So let us know. But where we left off when you were summoned out of your hotel room was I wanted to focus on the medium term. So we looked at the short term of what your company is, and now wanting to look at sort of what are some of the more medium term things that Dominion is thinking about. I always think about, since it's hurricane season, we look at sort of grid reliability gets a lot of attention this year. If you're able to speak to kind of the resilience and modernization of the grid as part of that, we'd be really interested to know, but the medium term, and then I will ask you a policy question to wrap us up.
And again, I apologize for this. This has never happened to me before, but I'm sure
Hey,
like, say that.
okay.
So medium term, but you see, I'm really committed here, right? So medium term, I'll talk about the grid, and it's, I can't really say it's really medium term. It's kind of all happening simultaneously, right? I mean, so as we're looking to build renewables and decarbonize, and we're having to think differently about how we manage centralized generation and whether we will still predominate with centralized generation, we're having to think a lot about land use, right? I mean, transmission issues are important because typically where you can build the renewable assets is not where the people are, right? So how you build transmission to get renewable energy to population centers is going to become a more significant issue. And getting some regulatory clarity around that is both a near term and medium term issue. If we're talking about generation technologies, we used to say that small nuclear reactors were long-term. I think that's probably more in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's probably a more medium-term issue. Hydrogen is starting to become more medium as opposed to long-term, right? I mean, hydrogen has the potential to be the miracle fuel, right? It could be used for transportation, generation. It could be used potentially at the burner tip for household heating and fuel needs. We're starting to see those first stage pilots happen and fuel mixing starting to occur. But again, we don't have a regulatory scheme that will allow significant fuel mixing. They're doing more of that in Europe than they are in America. Additionally, we have to rethink how we're using existing infrastructure. If we want to move away from natural gas, and as we will eventually move away from natural gas at some point, is our existing pipeline infrastructure capable of being repurposed for hydrogen, and what needs to be done to allow it to be used for that? I mean, so those are some of the things that we're thinking about near term. There a lot of our near term focus has to do with policy issues, right? I mean, because if you're going to, I mean, if you think about the whole kind of biosphere of what's happening around energy and decarbonization, these things all take capital. I think that's one of the things Rama was saying earlier. This will be a very capital intensive effort. And in order for firms like JPMorgan and others to put their capital at risk, in order for us as a management team and a utility or developer of these projects to take the risk of investing and developing those projects, we have to have clarity around the regulatory scheme that allows us to know that A, we're going to be able to build it, and B, that we're going to be able to generate a reasonable rate of return. So clarity around that, laws like the Virginia Clean Economy Act and others are going to be very, very important. But then even when you have a state regulatory regime that makes sense, you have to marry that with the federal regime, right? Because in so many situations, we have to deal with both state and federal agencies that aren't inherently coordinated. And so a state may have a policy and a program that says do this, and the feds are like, you talk to the Army Corps and they said, we have nothing to do with that. That's not our concern. Our focus and priority is something else. And so you sometimes find yourself getting those agencies to cooperate. You have capital is all very, very critical. So I would say those are near-term and medium-term issues. The things that I would put in the long term are, I mean, almost really everything is now, right? I mean, we're thinking about all these things at the same time, developing all these technologies at the same time. How do we reform policy? All that's happening in real time today. So yeah.
I've been doing this for like 18 months and I still don't know how to unmute myself. So thank you, Carlos, for weaving that in sort of with a policy conversation. Before I wrap us up, where we kind of all sort of synthesize, Carlos, was there anything else that you wanted to share? You talked about the regulatory regime. Is there anything else before we segue into the closing statements?
Well, I'll just add that, again, going back to the equity and environmental justice issue, that is going to be paramount, because if we're not careful with our intent to do well and do good with regard to decarbonization, we will do harm. And so, coupled with our conversations around decarbonization, energy reform, we have to make sure that we're always being mindful of those low wealth communities, of individuals that are paycheck to paycheck and that struggle every month, and that only can sustain so much bill shock as we pursue this greater objective. And so that has to be a part of the conversation in mediating what we do, when we do it, or how we do it. And we need our public policy officials to be involved in that.
Okay, no, thank you. So just as a closing thought from each of you, and we'll start with Jill, and then we'll do Rama, and then we'll end with Carlos. If you can just summarize again the near-term priorities and actions on climate, and which policy solutions can accelerate them. You can put that into a soundbite.
Okay, so we have ambitious climate goals. We can actually see the path to reaching them, but we're going to need that collaboration with policy, whether it's for alternative fuels or the kind of the R&D that's going to drive the long-term efficiencies. We can see the path, but it's going to take a ton of collaboration and people working together to get there.
Great. And Rama?
Yeah, look, I mean, I repeat what Jill said. Collaboration is such a key word. This is science meets finance meets regulatory policy arena that we're kind of dealing with on a daily basis. And for us to each be able to talk across these silos, right, and be able to understand other perspectives is such an important aspect of all this. And then look, from a more narrower JPMorgan perspective, we fully appreciate the urgency of the situation, and we want to do more than our part, right? We want to be a leader in this decarbonization journey, and we are putting our capital to work, right? I didn't mention this upfront, I should have. So on top of the Paris alignment commitment we also have a commitment to either directly finance or facilitate $1 trillion of green companies or green projects. Left it for the end because I didn't want to be forced to committing capital on this call. So look, we want to do that, right? We want to really support new technologies. It doesn't matter to us whether the new technologies are being developed by incumbent clients or somebody who just formed a company, right? We want to be there for them. We want to, some are clients today, some will be clients tomorrow. We want to be there for all of them.
Great. And thank you. And Carlos, for you, again, this is summarizing the Dominion's efforts and priorities at the moment and the policy solutions that can accelerate them.
Well, I'll be really brief. The first thing I'll say is that we're all in. We as Dominion, we believe that as in the utility sector, we should be and can be the enablers of many of the technologies and solutions that will help lead the way in decarbonization. And that includes both in power generation, power management, but also in other industries, transportation, marine, what have you. We think that we can play a role in that, and we're committed to doing that. We're engaging in the transition with regard to what we can do with our scope one. That plan is already laid out with regard to fuel switching from fossil to renewables. And we're going to do that very aggressively. We're exploring new technologies, SMR, hydrogen, and other items. But we also need a collaboration, as folks are saying, around policy clarity that will allow us to make these multi-billion-dollar investments and have clarity that we can get them done in a timely fashion, and that they can be done lucratively so that we can attract the capital to do that. And again, I'll just punctuate again, and while we're doing that, always being mindful of our most vulnerable communities.
Great. I want to thank Jill and Carlos and Rama today for joining us. And thank you very much. I learned a lot. I hope others did too. And we appreciate your time. So thank you with that. And with that, the webinar is over.
Thanks, Karina.